This podcast is brought to you by Reynolds and Reynolds, the industry leader in automotive technology. Learn how Spark AI, Reynolds' unified AI data layer, can help you unlock your full potential by visiting rey.com/spark-AI. That's rey.com/spark-AI.
Welcome to this weekend drive edition of Daily Drive for the fourth week in April 2025. I'm Jamie Butters, Executive Editor of Automotive News in Detroit.
And I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. We're breaking down some of the biggest stories in the auto industry from the past week and looking forward to what's in store in the days ahead. Today on the show, our own John Irwin talks about the latest tariff news and what to expect when rules about parts duties come out in the coming days.
We'll see where things end up, but certainly I think the auto industry would welcome any sort of USMCA tariff relief.
That's coming up in a few minutes, but first, Jamie, it was a pretty fast week. How you doing?
I'm hanging in there, Kel. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Were you ready to get into some news?
Let's do it.
All right, let's start off with Nissan. Recently, our own Molly Boygan spoke with Nissan sales boss Vinay Shahani, and he said, quote, "In this environment, I think we all have to be very nimble, and Nissan is proving that." Nissan also told dealers this week that there won't be any price hikes until June. And then finally, we reported on Thursday the company is possibly facing a $5.3 billion loss. Is Nissan proving to be nimble but at an extreme cost?
It's a tough one. I think global Nissan has not yet demonstrated nimbleness. But the new leadership, CEO Espinosa, is trying to get his hands around what's going on and what they're going to have to do. I think he's trying to set out expectations for, the worst case scenario and get people accepting the kind of deep restructuring that's going to need to go on. So they're still working on it. Maybe they will prove to be nimble, maybe not so much yet. But in North America, where Shahani and the Nissan team has been kind of caught on the back foot sometimes. They've had a rough year lately, and, they do need to be nimble. They need to be responsive to the inventory situation and their dealerships' needs and what's going on in the market. So right now they have quite a bit of inventory. They're going to hold the line on prices and try to maybe gain a little market share, but they're going to have to really, watch it and not oversell and also not carry too much inventory. So we'll see how they do.
Interesting. And Toyota chairman Akio Toyoda is proposing a buyout of supplier Toyota Industries. Could we see more major automakers do the same to have more control and vertically integrate their supply chains, especially in a time with all the tariffs and duties?
Yes, sort of. I think this is such a peculiar situation, and I'm not sure that I understand all the political nuances within the Toyota Keiretsu of what's going on here exactly. I do think there's something going on there, and we'll see how that works out. But you're absolutely right about the broader trend. If these parts tariffs go into effect next week, and especially if the USMCA rules go into effect, there are going to be a lot of suppliers, small suppliers, facing a lot of extra costs, and they're going to need to turn to their customers, whether those are the higher tiers or all the way to the automakers. The automakers are going to be reluctant to actually buy suppliers outright, but they might have to. In a lot of cases, they might just try to supply them with the working capital that they need to absorb their own higher costs and make the parts and get them sold and keep them solvent until they get paid, some 60 days later or so.
And finally, 2 months after pausing retooling at Brampton Assembly Plant, Stellantis has yet to call back staff and resume work. Do you think the tariff situation is the reason Brampton is still paused? And how do you expect Unifor to react if the plant isn't back online sooner than later?
Yeah, I suspect it's mostly the tariffs. Of course, Stellantis still doesn't have a CEO, so there may be some indecision and some reluctance to commit capital to projects that the new CEO may or may not think are the right ones. But we know the big thing that's changed the picture in the last 2 months. It's been the tariff threats. So naturally, they want to make sure that what they're tooling for is something they can sell. And if the vehicles they make there can really only be sold in Canada and Mexico, that's a lot less exciting to invest in. Unifor so far, I think, has really blamed the U.S. government more so than Stellantis management and leadership. if they're still out of work for a longer period of time, I wouldn't be surprised to see them take to the streets, but they might be protesting Donald Trump instead of John Elkann.
Good stuff, Jamie. Coming up, if you've had trouble keeping up with all the twists and turns related to tariffs, we've got you covered. Our own John Irwin joins us next on Weekend Drive.
As your business gets more complex, it feels like productivity can't go any higher. You need a way to move forward to a future where you don't have to start every interaction from scratch. You don't have to search for actionable information. You don't have to manually pull data to make decisions. You need a future where the complex is made simple and you can do more with less. How do you get there? It all starts with a spark. Unlock your full potential with the next generation of automotive dealership technology that actually does some of the heavy lifting for you by texting leads, transcribing calls, making data-backed recommendations, and boosting your overall productivity so that you can spend your time and energy on what truly matters, selling cars and growing your business. Spark AI, Reynolds' unified AI data layer, can empower your dealership to operate more efficiently and effectively than ever before, so you can do more, sell more, and make more. To learn how Spark AI can help your dealership reach its full potential, visit rayrey.com/spark-AI today. That's REYREY.com/spark-AI to learn more.
Welcome back to Weekend Drive. I'm Jamie Butters with Kellen Walker. The complexity and ever-changing nature of President Trump's trade policies make them difficult to keep up with. It's been all hands on deck here at Automotive News to keep readers informed about what we know now and what to expect going forward when it comes to tariffs and their impacts across the industry. Right now, we're keeping an eye on one of the biggest expected developments on that front. By May 3rd, the Trump administration will set rules related to its 25% tariff on auto parts that are set to take effect by that day. Our own John Irwin has been leading our tariff coverage at Automotive News. He joins me now from his home office in Ann Arbor, Michigan, to talk about what we should expect. John Irwin, welcome back to Weekend Drive.
Thanks for having me back.
You know, the tariff and trade landscape changes so quickly. I feel like we need to have you on once in a while just to help kind of level set where we're at. So with that in mind, next week, no later than Saturday, May 3rd, there's supposed to be new tariffs placed on auto parts. What is that expected to look like?
Yeah, it can happen anytime between now and May 3rd, but it's looking like it'll be, as of right now, a 25% tariff on a wide range of auto imports, ranging from auto parts imports, ranging from engines to transmissions, powertrain components, electrical components, that sort of thing. It's a very wide list. It doesn't cover every single auto part, most of them. If it's coming from anywhere outside of Canada or Mexico, it'll be subject to a 25% tariff on the entire value of the part. If it's coming from Canada or Mexico, there's a little bit of a carve-out, though, as we saw with the vehicle tariffs. Out of the gate, they won't be subject to any tariffs at all as long as they meet the requirements of the USMCA and its rules for free trade. That covers most of the parts that come into the U.S. from Canada and Mexico. Not all of them, but around 80% or so, at least as of 2023. So those parts, at least for now, won't be subject to any tariffs. Trump's executive order that he signed back at the end of March directs the Commerce Department to come up with a mechanism to basically subtract the value of the U.S. content in that part and make the 25% tariff subject to only the non-American content in that part. It's sort of like what we see with vehicles right now. But until that happens, there won't be any tariff. There's not the clear indication of when that mechanism might come into place, but that's something we're keeping an eye out for.
You mentioned that the parts tariffs set to be announced next week cover most auto parts. What kinds of things are not included there? What happens with those?
Yeah, there are a handful of parts that aren't on the list of parts that are subject to this tariff. A handful that include like a handful of braking components and certain ADAS systems and things like along those lines. Anything that's not on the harmonized tariff schedule, specifically called out as being subject to the parts tariff, is instead subject to the reciprocal tariffs, which right now just stand at 10% on pretty much all U.S. trading partners. except Canada and Mexico, and China, of course, where that number is at 125%. So those parts will be subject to those depending on where they're from. It's important to note that the auto parts tariffs, like the vehicles, the reciprocal tariffs don't apply to those. So,
Right. The reciprocals are separate from the auto
right,
industry tariffs.
exactly.
So for Canada and Mexico, are they 25% for regular imports, like non-auto parts, auto imports?
Yeah, it depends. Again, there's a USMCA exemption. It is 25%, but if they comply with the terms of the USMCA, they can still be shipped tariff free. That was originally slated to end back in April, but the White House has sort of indefinitely extended that. So that's still in effect. So if we're talking about one of these parts that isn't on the list of auto parts tariffs and they're coming from Canada and Mexico, if they meet the terms of the USMCA, they'll also be able to still trade or go over the border tariff free.
So with this deadline looming this past week, a variety of associations representing automakers, suppliers, dealers got together and warned the administration that auto parts tariffs, could lead to, really severe disruptions, possibly even supplier bankruptcies. Did they get any kind of response?
It's interesting the response that automakers, suppliers have seemingly gotten from the White House. They've been pretty aggressively lobbying the White House against the auto tariffs in general, and specifically the parts tariffs. And it seems like the White House is at least listening to them, being a little receptive to what they're pitching. We've seen Trump himself said on April 14th, he's considering certain tariffs, exemptions for auto companies because they need some time to move components from Canada into the U.S. or from Mexico into the U.S. There's no real indication of what that might look like definitively, and if anything might happen at all. But we have seen some reports from Bloomberg and the Financial Times that the White House is considering certain exemptions. One of them being on making that USMCA exemption, where parts that come into the U.S. from Canada and Mexico that meet the USMCA's requirements, they won't be tariffed as of now, but could be in the future. They might just decide to make that permanent,
or at least indefinite.
Indefinite,
the exception could be indefinite.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, maybe making parts exempt from steel and aluminum tariffs, which has been a big headache for a lot of suppliers as they try to figure out the exact steel and aluminum percentages inside parts that they import and what might be subject to those tariffs. That's another thing they're considering. They might also consider exempting Chinese parts from the 20% fentanyl tariffs that Trump originally put into place back in February and March. Again, those parts aren't subject to the 125% reciprocal tariff, but they are, as of right now, subject to the 20% fentanyl tariff. So there's some consideration that maybe that would end. But again, these are all under consideration. Nothing has been decided upon as of when we're talking right now. We'll see what we'll end up with. Again, it's just going to be, whatever. It's up to Trump at the end of the day, and he's being, pitched by the automakers, by suppliers about why they need some sort of relief. He's clearly open to that, but he's also hearing, from people like Peter Navarro in the White House who are probably pushing for a more hardline stance. So we'll kind of see where things end up.
Yeah, you mentioned the challenge of calculating, the steel and aluminum tariffs, and I don't doubt you for a second that that's a headache, but it's also just paying the taxes, right? I mean, a lot of steel and aluminum comes from Canada, and if you have to pay those 25% taxes on top of the parts tariff or a 2.5% or whatever, I mean, that gets expensive. You're talking about, a $2,000 engine or a $1,000 transmission, and you add 25% because it's basically all steel or aluminum. That adds significant cost that really could erode profitability or worse.
Right. Yeah. And the stacking nature of these tariffs is something that's been a big source of concern for the auto industry, whether it's automakers and especially suppliers. Suppliers have been, as we've talked about before, suppliers over the last several years have had to deal with, the pandemic and then chip shortages and labor shortages, inflation. They really, more than automakers and dealers even were hit particularly hard by that. And, as the Auto Coalition wrote to the White House, a lot of suppliers just aren't capitalized to deal with all these tariffs at once. And, again, as we saw during the pandemic, if you're just missing one part, if one supplier is down, that could have, shut down the entire supply chain. You might not be able to make your vehicle. And so that's been a big concern that, as these tariffs, it's not just a 25% auto tariff, but it's 25% plus maybe the steel and aluminum tariff on top of that, plus maybe some others depending on where you're coming from. So everything adds up pretty quickly, and those costs compound. And that's been a pretty big concern for a lot of these companies. And one of the big things that they're trying to convince the White House that the auto industry, just a lot of companies in the supply chain, just might not be able to weather that type of hefty tax increase very quickly.
You mentioned the possibility of the USMCA exemption being extended, and it's so curious to me. It seems like such a reversal. When Trump started his tariff play, it really hit hard at Canada and Mexico, our two closest neighbors, big trading partners, and China. But, really, very confrontational with Canada and Mexico. And now, at least for now, and maybe for quite a while, they could really benefit. More sourcing could be moved to Canada and Mexico, at least to North America, from Europe or Japan or Korea, to serve the transplants in the southern U.S. Obviously, these things take time. It takes months, but over the course of the administration, if North America can remain sort of a free trade zone, it seems like a win for Canada and Mexico, despite all the scrap they've been through.
Yeah, especially when you go back and look at, right after Trump took office, and then the original 25% tariffs on that were originally supposed to apply to all Canadian and Mexican goods. If you would have told automakers and suppliers back then, maybe there's an indefinite pause on parts tariffs if they're USMCA compliant, I think most of them would have gladly taken that. And yeah, it's something where I think that's something that automakers and suppliers have been really pushing for, just because they've been making the point for months now that how interconnected the supply chain is in North America. It's something that's brought up again and again and again, but it's true. Parts can cross the border 7 or 8 times, from Mexico into the U.S. into Canada and back. And if these parts tariffs come into place, all of a sudden that might not become as viable. But if you can keep the flow of that moving, automakers might be able to better absorb some of the other tariffs. Like we've already seen, a lot of automakers are sort of at the moment, at least with the vehicle tariffs, maybe standing pat or waiting to see what happens. And they might not be able to do that with parts tariffs, though, just because of the immediate impact that might have on the supply chain if they come into effect on USMCA goods. So, I think that's something where Canada and Mexico could, certainly benefit from that. It's important to note, though, we still don't know where things will end up. Trump is still, just this week has been kind of signaled again, sort of a combative tone with Canada. Again, more talk about Canadian factories, quote unquote, stealing U.S. jobs, and he suggested that Canadian auto imports might be subject to higher tariffs in the future. So we'll kind of see where things end up. Obviously, there's a question of if this is all a negotiating ploy or if it's something a little more serious.
Permanent policy.
Yeah. So we'll see where things end up, but certainly I think the auto industry would welcome any sort of USMCA tariff relief.
John Irwin covers auto suppliers, tariffs, and trade for us at Automotive News. John, thanks so much for the chat.
Thanks, Jamie.
That's all for this weekend drive edition of Daily Drive. I'm Jamie Butters.
And I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to Automotive News executive producer Jake Neer for his help on today's podcast. You can get the latest news on tariffs, manufacturing, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com.
Come back on Monday for a conversation about McKinsey's new study that shows U.S. consumers' EV trepidation is easing. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. If you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.